Well, this is the last session of the PEPA, the third PEPA meeting, and this is the keynote session. After such fruitful 2 days of discussion and work, I'm sure we had good discussions, and also everyone could know each other better with this very intensive period together. And I'm very delighted to be the chair of this session and to have Greg Schaefer with us as the keynote speaker, who kindly accepted our invitation for a long flight to be here in these 2 days. I'm sure all of you know Greg's work and has been inspired by his papers and new ideas. And I propose to have him as the keynote that is very strategically chosen for the meeting is the way that Greg has been working with international economic law and how it has been possible to think about new approaches to work with international economic law. And this is about what he will talk in this session this evening. So I give him the floor. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the organizers for bringing me here and for you all for coming here. I've learned a great deal, and much of what I'm going to say, I think, resonates with what I heard at this conference. So it's first going to be a bit theoretical. It's really a talk on a new legal realist approach to international economic law. So I'll say a little bit about what legal realism and a new legal realism is, and I think you'll see that it resonates with many of the papers here. And then I'll give some examples of this in practice in terms of my own academic experience and learning through doing research. And then I'll open it up to what I think just are some important questions which we've seen at this conference, but how to think about going forward. And then we can open in terms of research, and then we'll have some time for questions, discussion, comments, and so forth. So first, I was going to address a little bit the issue of method in international economic law scholarship. And to tap, and I'm going to do so in terms of a context that I've been writing in a series of papers called a legal realist or a new legal realist approach to international economic law. And to do that, I'm going to start off with 2 quotations from 2 non-legal sources. The first is from a letter from Anton Chekhov, the writer, to Alexei Suvorin of 1892. And he wrote in that letter, "Let her first say what is, and only then I will listen to what one can and must do." And those words parallel, "let her first say what is, and only then I will listen to what one can and must do." Those words parallel a famous statement of probably the central figure in legal realism in the United States, which was a movement during the 1930s, which was its chief as any movement. It defines itself in many ways, again, in terms of what it's against, and what it was against was a form of what referred to as legal formalism or classical legal science in the 1930s. And Llewellyn wrote in 1931, "The argument is simply that no judgment of what ought to be done in the future with respect to any part of law can be intelligently made without knowing objectively as far as possible what that part of law is now doing." Llewellyn thus called for the temporary divorce of is and ought for purposes of study. The statement of Chekhov, a doctor, is particularly relevant to a field which is dedicated to prescriptions, yet spends far too little time on diagnoses. The second quote that resonates with a different aspect of a new legal realist scholarly agenda is from the writer James Baldwin, who disillusioned with an African American, who disillusioned with American racism, left the United States in 1948 for France, where he lived much of his remaining life as an expatriate. Baldwin is quoted as saying, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions which have been hidden by the answers." And one can paraphrase that statement in terms of the theme of this talk, the purpose of engaging in research in a new legal realist vein is to uncover issues to which otherwise we are ignorant, to which otherwise we are blind. That's the craft of new legal realism. It's the experimentalist, pragmatist approach of uncovering new knowledge by asking new forms of questions through a critical gaze. So this approach that combines both empirical approach and a pragmatic, critical approach is particularly important for analysis of international economic law in a world characterized by constituencies with different priorities, perspectives, and opportunities to be heard, in which the most read and influential international law scholarship tends to be written by those from particular backgrounds, working in particular countries, working in a particular language. International law's significance, of course, to the extent international law is effective, it has implications which penetrate deeply within nation states, affecting nation state stakeholders. It's increasingly recognized not only within the legal academy, but across the social sciences. And that reflects in a shift in views toward international law from the international relations realist tradition, which should not be confused with legal realism. International relations realism views international law as epiphenomenal, since it contends that state power alone determines international outcomes. Legal realism has parallels with international relations realism in that both respond to formal idealist views of law, whether legal formalism for legal realism or international law liberalism for international relations realist. They both attempt in different ways to get underneath what shapes international law on the one hand and how it operates in practice on the other. In doing so, both are interested in the interaction of power and interest, but with law and law's normativity. And there the resemblance ends, in part because legal realism and international relations realism arose in different moments in response to different contexts. Legal realism rose and gained prominence at the time of social ferment in the 1930s, a time where progressives pushed for social legislation to address inequalities arising from the era of the Roaring Twenties and the earlier Gilded Age. It responded to the legitimization of such inequalities that formal law gave with its constitutional doctrines of liberty of contract and its restraints on both state and federal legislation to address them. It critiqued formalism for its failure to look at the operation of power in the private marketplace, and thus the law in action and the consequences of legal doctrines and interpretive methods that legal formalists used. We live, of course, now in a new Gilded Age, as captured by the work of Piketty's the French economist's new work, Capitalism in the 21st Century, that shows that actually we've moved back to an age in which, in terms of the relationship between economic growth and the growth of income within capital, we see an increasing domain, an increasing inequality. So that is that the question and challenge is how we should think about and address international economic law in that context. In contrast to the old legal realism, a new legal realism is both domestic and international in its focus, and it's what I call in other work transnational in its focus. It arises from the legal academy, but like the old legal realism, it searches out links with the social science disciplines. New legal realism in international law, however, unlike the old legal realism, is particularly interested in the interactions of domestic and international law and transnational context. That is, it's interested in the deeper implications of international economic law within nation states. That is, in terms of their markets, their institutions, the role of courts, administrative agencies, of bureaucracies, legislatures, the impact on professions. Just to give one example, think of the growth of the intellectual property profession around the world. Think of the growth in law schools of international property law. It's a construct, right? It's a new legal field, right, which is a transnational legal field. And the influence on the normative frames in which we see law, in which we conceive social problems. New legal realism, however, also differs from social sciences approaches to law and its commitment to understanding the particular role of and language and normativity of law. So it takes legal doctrine quite seriously. It does not simply subsume law under the language of another discipline, such as power and international relations. It rather attempts to couple the empirical study of the law and action of international law within a transnational context, with a clear understanding of legal institutions and legal norms, and how the understanding of legal norms shape understandings of appropriate behavior within nation states. New legal realism, as applied to international law, has, in my view, 4 key attributes. First and most importantly, it is concerned with empirical method to understand how international law operates and has effects. Second, it stresses the need to study the role of institutions in mediating the pursuit of any social goal. Much of international law scholarship, especially its normative scholarship, focuses on normative goals, but not how the pursuit of any normative goal is going to be mediated through the type of institutions that we create. Third, it takes seriously critical concerns about the biases inherent in methods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about concerns about the turn to empirical study of law. And fourth, it is pragmatic, aiming to translate its empirical findings for actors who can use them as practical tools. These attributes have much in common with the old legal realists. They too were concerned with inequality and biases, masked by formal legal doctrines and their time. They too responded to normative concerns. They too did so at a time of national and international ferment. So if it's time for a reinvigoration of legal realism, what's new here? What's new in a new legal realism is first and arguably most important developments in method. While the legal realists called for greater empirical work so that the practice and thus the meaning of law would be better understood, they were less accomplished in practicing what they preached. They were less accomplished in part because the social sciences themselves were much less developed. Empiricism, in contrast, lies at the heart of the new legal realist scholarly commitment. New legal realists engage in empirical work, unlike most of their old legal realist predecessors. Just as there was great diversity with the old legal realists, there will be great diversity today among those using the new legal realist mantle. For example, Cass Sunstein has called the use of quantitative methods in assessing judicial decisions as a form of new legal realism, something Mark Bush, Christophe Pelk, Chad Bone, and others have done regarding WTO decisions. Daniel Farber in the United States has written of new legal realism in terms of behavioral economics, recently taken up by Anna van Aken, Tomer Broda, and others in international economic law. While others write from law and society and institutionalist perspectives, often building from qualitative methods of interviews, process tracing, and participant observation. Second, a new legal realism foregrounds the role of institutions. It examines how abstract law is translated in different institutional environments, aware that all institutional alternatives are imperfect, and thus the pursuit of goals will always be mediated in different ways through different institutional processes. In particular, because all decision-making processes are characterized by unequal participation, a key question is how affected constituencies participate directly or indirectly, how they are otherwise represented directly or indirectly in different institutional contexts in comparison with alternative, non-idealized settings. So if much of international economic law, in my view, is about the management of externalities, the negative implications of domestic decision-making for foreigners, for outsiders, clearly that's a biased form of institutional decision-making. Clearly, within WTO or OECD or other international contexts also are subject to biases. So how do we think about the relative imperfections? There's no institutional nirvana in terms of trying to address the basic international economic law concerns that we face in a world where any decision-making in any one nation state is going to affect constituencies and others. So in particular, within the international economic law context, how do we think about the relative role for policy space to provide for experimental learning on the one hand and externalities on the other? That's one of the conundrums that any policy area in international economic law will have to face. Third, a new legal realism must be self-reflective in terms of critical inquiry to encourage experimentation and learning, so that we don't simply all work within a single frame of how we conceive of problems. Much of international trade law, for example, could be viewed traditionally as a two-step, right? It's all based on a sort of a static comparative advantage perspective that we want to move towards free trade because of we increase economic welfare through specialization, through comparative advantage. And on the other hand, we need an international institution to get there because of political process failures where protection interests are better represented before legislatures and consumers. So that's the traditional way, at least in the United States. Every international trade law casebook basically sets up with this frame and then teaches the law after it. And so you can see this is quite ideological, right? It's sort of almost biased then and towards seeing free trade as a proper outcome. But as we move towards much deeper implications in terms of regulation and regulatory choices, such as free movement of capital and prudential regulation and so forth, how do we address that frame simply doesn't work anymore. So how do we need new frames, right, to try to think about the issues that confront us today in international economic law and regionalism, and as was discussed today, sort of what is regulatory coherence or regulatory cooperation, what does it mean? And so it must address, so I want to say a little bit about the risks, right, especially for us in law schools of this empirical turn. If you look at, in terms of not just the social sciences, but the hard sciences, coming out with a new article which critiques much of the quantitative regressions used in the United States to study how judges make decisions. And much of this comes out of what's called attitudinalism in legal research, and that is the hypothesis is that judges, the outcomes of judicial decision-making in the U.S. Supreme Court are determined by a judge's political priors and not by law. And so that law, once again, is epiphenomenal. And it's all based then on the variables, which the variable will be the political party that selected the judge, and how predictive that is in terms of the outcome on a particular dispute. And this, of course, this is, whenever you choose variables, the challenge is that the variables are already reflecting, right, your theoretical priors. And this, and often they may show a correlation, but it doesn't, but it's, notice what's not in the variable is anything with respect to law and legal normativity and the institutions of law that can cabin decision-making. And so we cite critiques of much of the quantitative work in the hard sciences, in particular genetics. And we all know the sorry history of the world of genetics in terms of the analytic priors, in terms of genetic predispositions, and to assess everything from sterilizing those who were predisposed to crime or predisposed to be a charge on the welfare state and so forth, to go back to a famous decision, Buck v. Bell, that was written by, where Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a very famous decision. And it turns out that, you know, in terms of the modern genomics, that in terms of our genes, we're between 99.5 and 99.9% have exactly the same genetic makeup, right? But nonetheless, there's an incredible amount of National Social Science Foundation work that still goes to try to get to race and genes, right, to try to address medicine and pharmaceuticals development. And so it plays into all of these analytic priors. And it turns out also that there was research published by a Stanford epidemiologist, John Ioannidis, that 95% of the research that is done on genetics turns out to be wrong. Turns out to only show correlations and not causation, right? And so we need to be incredibly wary of this, especially in law, because of the implications for public policy. And it's the reason why I mentioned genetics, because genetics obviously had major public policy implications in the 20th century. And because it has suddenly the aura of science, right? And it has the aura of science and play into public policy debate. So we need to be very, very careful. And so even though a new legal realism is going to advance and call for the social scientific study of law, it also is going to waive the caveats of the need to continually sort of critique any sort of social scientific outcomes that we find. And that empirical should not also simply be defined by quantitative regressions, but we need multiple different methods that constitute the empirical enterprise. And fourth and finally, the new legal realism is committed to communicating its empirical findings in a manner that's relevant for actors who wish to participate practically to address social problems. That empirical questions should be addressed by not in terms of what quantitative data we might have available, which are easy to analyze, but rather they should be addressed by what are the major social problems and major questions that we face. And then we should be looking for how to try to address this methodologically. But it's too easy to look to where we already have indicators, which may be very imperfect indicators, and use those to be able to try to come up with new counterintuitive findings. What I mean by normative, though, the normative aspect of new legal realism is that often, I think, and you could call this, I've called it before, sort of the high priest of being an international law scholar, that once one reaches a certain reputation, one makes all sorts of pronouncements in terms of the way the world should be governed with. And those, of course, tend to be made by people within a particular form of academic power, being at the greatest institutions and so forth, having PhD students and so forth. But that we have to always we have to have something which would come from what I call a pragmatist tradition, which is to understand what we don't know, right? We live in a world of incredible uncertainty. And so instead of what a traditional rational choice perspective would be, is that we sort of know what our social welfare ends are, and then we just try to find out the best means to reach them. That's not pragmatist at all, because pragmatists say we never can be certain what our ends are. The best we can have, we have to have certain concepts, we have to have certain goals, but they're ends in view, and they have to be subject to continual reevaluation based on our experience. And it's that learning from experience that is so central to this particular enterprise. So elsewhere I've cited a famous phrase by the French child psychologist Piaget, which said that for a child, the child, when it imitates, what it's actually doing is it's always reinventing, right? And so also when we think about how to apply, for example, how to apply international economic law, there's no one single way to do it. It's a frame, right, which provides for constraints. But for instance, intellectual property law or otherwise, you have to have an end in view, and then you imitate, but in doing so, you're reinventing within your own particular local and social context. So I'm going to say just a few. I was going to give a bunch of examples in this paper, which is forthcoming for a book on new legal realism, edited by my former colleague Hans Klug, who's at University of Wisconsin. He's a South African. Maybe I'll just give one example, which I've given before. Some of you may know. But as far as me, I came, as an American trying to write, and at a time when the major issue, which I think still is a major issue, which is what the relationship between trade and environment is. And of course, that led to the great riots in Seattle. And one of the issues that I came to when I first looked at this is I came with my own American priors, which was that the WTO was biased against the environment, that it needed a corrective to take into account environmental issues to a greater extent than it did. And what I did was I learned, and I think this is true with any empirical enterprise, is that that when it approaches a question in an open and objective manner, one is almost always surprised by how wrong one's initial assumptions were. So in this particular case, when I went to Geneva, what happened is that my interviews turned into lectures, particularly from individuals from developing country governments and non-governmental organizations, about how all my questions reflected an American frame. I learned about how environmental issues and thus this trade environment debate was constructed and being constructed by U.S. and European academics, non-governmental organizations, and representatives compared to their developing country counterparts. I learned of the advantages of the resources and status that U.S. and European universities bring, of our greater access to Western media and learned journals, and our advantages with English being the international language to diffuse our framings of the issues. I learned how the term environment has vastly different meanings to stakeholders in developing countries, where it is much more difficult to separate the concept from that of development because people's livelihoods are more intimately connected on a day-to-day basis to the environment. So much of environmental at this time was focused on environmental preservation, particular of species such as sea turtles and so forth, as opposed to other environmental type issues. And so I went into the records of all the committee meetings in the WTO to see who spoke on which issues on trade and environment. And there were 6 different issues, and it turned out that the U.S. representatives basically were the most active on issues such as unilateralism and protection of endangered species and preservationism. But developing countries in India and elsewhere were much more active in terms of the Convention on Biodiversity, traditional knowledge, and so forth, where suddenly there was a very different perspective of U.S. negotiators. And so you could see how framing of a particular issue really mattered. And so my assumptions and expectations were upset by weeks of interviewing and discussing the issues, and then going back and looking at the records. I could give many other examples, and I won't, but in terms of some key substantive issues I think that were addressed here, I'll mention 4, which I find for research going forward. One is the relationship between trade and monetary law and finance law, and more generally then trade in multiple areas. So Vera Thorstensen mentioned this morning about currency, on which he's mentioned a great deal. And the question then that is beyond currency. It's what's the interaction between different institutions where policy has been segmented, where one institution, the International Monetary Fund, has its policy domain, but another institution, the World Trade Organization, currency policy clearly affects trade. And so how do we address the necessary institutional interaction between different institutions? Another area which really hasn't been mentioned, but I think is very, very important, especially given all the FTAs and bilateral investment treaties, is capital controls. And so how do we address the issue of capital controls today with this proliferation of bilateral investment treaties, many of which the models provide for actually no prudential exceptions whatsoever to implement capital controls? So here we have not only the GATS agreement and the IMF and its concerns about international financial stability, but a proliferation of these FTAs. So how do we address the issue of capital controls and prudential regulation, be it in TPP, TTIP, and so forth? Investment clearly is another major issue which is linked to both capital controls, for example. So when we talk about how can we think about the institutional choices for address the concerns of investment, I've been very wary of investor protection where you have these ad hoc panels. So can we think about sort of new institutional mechanisms, so either to create an appellate body or somehow link domestic processes and of domestic courts to be as a first level of review and so forth. The second, I think, is ongoing, is huge, is trade and social policy. We've seen this in terms of development and industrial policy space. So where do we see sort of the role for experimentation of an industrial policy on the one hand, which would involve subsidies, or climate change, also subsidies? And where do we see concerns with respect, the SIEL case is really opening up in WTO jurisprudence sort of moral concerns and public policy concerns. How constraining should the WTO be? What should be the role for domestic policy on labor issues and so forth? That's not going to go away, and we're seeing this debate deepening now as the trade regime deepens. The third is, what interests me in particular is how do we I think that the key to studying international economic law is really a transnational perspective, because it's not really, it's an interstate system for the most part, but it really affects private parties. And for it to have any sort of real implications, it's going to have to penetrate and permeate nation-state governance. And so how does this take place? What are the implications for domestic institutions? So even if we don't have, and most legal formalism will talk about monist versus dualist jurisdictions and direct effect versus indirect effect. But from a legal realist perspective, these are just formal concepts. What really matters is, how the shaping of professionals, such as the shaping of what we teach in law schools, the shaping of institutions, the shaping of courts. The WTO calls for all sorts of judicial review and customs law and intellectual property law and other areas of law. And so what are the relative role of courts and administrative bodies in their relationship with legal professionals? That's the real impact of international economic law. And that then calls for comparative work, what happens within domestic regulation. Much of it's happened here at FGV, but within a larger international law, transnational law context. And finally, I think there's a role for how we frame the overall enterprise of what do we think of international economic law. As I mentioned before, I think traditionally international economic law has been about protectionism. But I think we've gone, and that's clearly still a central frame. But I think that's a particular frame in which all regulation is first of all viewed within a protectionist frame. But clearly we live in a world in which regulation, that's just one part of regulation, to only see it in that particular frame is missing where much of transnational and international law is going to be going in the future, which is either involving international harmonization or mutual recognition or other forms of regulatory borrowing and cooperation, which is addressing the externalities of one state's regulation on others, while at the same time providing for policy space so that there's not one simple way of doing things, but we learn from what others are doing in terms of their own domestic context. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. This is very important for us, all of us, to know how legal technique is in a broader context than that only of applying law and thinking about a critical perspective. I will then collect 3 questions and then go back to Greg and then collect more if we have time.
Thanks, Professor Shah, for your comments. My question relates to the empirical method which you mentioned. How do you, because I conducted a few interviews and discussions, how do you manage the bias and how do you overcome the problem of bias when you're trying to do your research in a very pragmatic way when your interviewees are from different sectors, for example, in my case, from public and private sector, and where you can see a clear contradiction in the versions provided by public sector, private sector, semi-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. So while doing this sort of research with a more pragmatic and fresh opinion and fresh approach, how do you overcome the problem of bias in the collection of research outcomes and findings?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, first, recognizing that you're in a situation where any particular empirical evidence that you're going to get is going to be subject to bias, right? And all methods are subject to bias. So how I've tried to address that is exactly, I think what I heard you say, is that you talk to many different people who have many different interests, right? And trying to see if you can get a common story for people who have no interest in telling you a common story. And to the extent that you can get that, then of course, each interview gives you more information, which then can be fed into other interviews. And of course, it also provides you with certain inside information, which will give incentives for an interviewee to correct themselves, right? And you find that the more you learn, that the interviewees will then be surprised at what you already know, right? And then you reach a certain level of confidence where they're not just simply telling you sort of a formal story, which is the official story, but you can only build that through sustained interviewing, which is systematic, as opposed to interviewing just a few people and then taking that to somehow reflect reality. So that's number one. It's a systemic, sustained interviewing. The second is to always try to see if you can check that interviewing against other sources, right? So you can look to official records, you can look to media accounts, and so forth. And so you always try, to the extent that you can, so for instance, as the early trade and environment tried to look at committee reports to see the official reports, and the interviewing led me to look, because of course there's millions of pages of WTO committee reports, or thousands. So always the question is what to look for, right? And often the beauty of interviewing is it provides you with sort of helping you to know what to look for, right? And then you can start to look and and there, of course, use some quantitative data, right? Is that you can code your search to look to, and then you can create tables and quantitative tables and so forth, which would back up some of what you came through from the interviews, or at least check it, right? And so I would always try not to rely only on your interviews, right? But on some sort of supplementary type work where you can find it.
One more. It's on the back.
Hi, thank you. Professor, I was very interested, actually it's been an interest of mine, in the SIEL's case and about the public morals argument. And I'm glad that you brought it up. But I was thinking about what's the difference between the argument that you cannot use your internal market to inflict pain in some animals, or the same argument that you don't want to use an internal market to explore the work of people in a developing country or something like that. So the difficulty is, where can you close, like I think one of the panels here said, the floodgate. That's a real danger. How can you create some kind of barrier to that?
Yeah. So I think there's
May I add a question to this?
Yeah.
The new legal realism is like a movement inside U.S. For all fields of work in law. And I would like to hear from you, what's the difference that you see applying the method of, in case you see any, applying the method of new legal realism in law generally, thinking about more domestic law? And is there any difference in the method when we apply it in international law, economic law, or international law field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, it's in the same line, because we have that famous quote from legal realism that law is what the judges had for breakfast.
Which was never said.
Well, at least they're in the books.
Yes, it was said by the critics of legal realism.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the point is, coming to this new legal realism to international law, is law what is the appellate body says? I mean, in the morning, in the breakfast.
What they ate for breakfast. Good. Okay, let me just take those three. And so let me start off with that one. So probably it's a brilliant book if you ever, Jerome Frank's book, Law in the Modern Mind, probably comes the closest to saying that, but Frank never said that. But it's repeated over and over again, and I've written 2 articles with someone who keeps putting in that same phrase, and I keep taking it out of our articles because it's saying no one said that, right? And to differentiate what we call the new legal realism from the old legal realism. I think but there's actually, so 2 things on that. One is, what the judge ate for breakfast, right, is scoffed at, right? But it's actually an empirical question. So, but it's a little bit different, though. But there's a fascinating Israeli paper that came out, which was what were the rates of a judge. I can't remember if it was accepting something to do with a criminally accused, right, which showed the rate either the penalty or accepting a plea bargain or something with huge consequences, right, where the state is taking away the liberty of an individual. And what they found was that the rate to the prejudice of the accused went up significantly the hours after lunch. Right? And I mean, I don't know if you've ever graded exams, right? But you get tired, right, at a certain time of the day, right? And everyone knows that in the afternoon, you can get a little tired if you don't have a cup of coffee. So anyway, that's sort of fascinating. It should at least, it's valid work, right? Not to say that, all law can be reduced to whether or not it was before lunch or after lunch. That would be ridiculous. But to actually do empirical work that judges should take quite seriously, because students always accuse us that it's all random how we grade our exams, right? And that judges and we take that quite seriously, right? Because we don't want that to be the case. And it's a risk, right, of when we grade the exam could affect what its grade is. And certainly if you're taking someone's liberty away, you want to try to figure out how to be self-corrective in your institution. So that's just a prelude, right, to even what's considered a very silly claim is worth an empirical study, right? But I think the greater empirical study would be, what country appointed you will determine how the country, what the judges. So my friend James Gotti has been blocked from joining the appellate body, basically, because the United States doesn't trust that he will protect U.S. interests, right, on the appellate body. So that's an aspect. But I think that what the danger which we critique in a new paper coming out is it reduces all judging to politics, right? But judges are part that it misses, it subsumes all law in terms of particular trope, right, which is a political science trope about power and interest and nationality. But law is a normative enterprise, right? And it's both that. Clearly the United States is very interested in who the members of the appellate body are, right? And they're very interested in that because law actually has implications, right, for U.S. policy and its future relations with China. So this is a major, very politically sensitive issue. But at the same time, once that person is selected, right, they're part of a body of 7 judges. They're part of a body that's being scrutinized by many members of this audience, right, who are writing art. They're part of a body that has to justify their decision through legal reasoning. And to say that you can, so that law is a combination of both, right? It's power matters because, and the United States certainly is a powerful player in trying to shape the rules, but also legal reasoning matters. And you can't understand, so a legal realist, unlike an IR realist, which will reduce everything to power, and unlike a legal idealist, which will reduce everything to some sort of idealized form of reasoning, will say, no, both are involved, right? And it's the tension between the two, right, which is what's really interesting. So that would be sort of in terms of the new legal realist pushback that all law just becomes what the judge ate for breakfast, or all law just happens to be about the legitimation of political power. is part of it, right? And we should uncover it, and it's our responsibility to try to address it and not to ignore it and put on our little blinders. But I think it's more than that. The difference between international and domestic law and new legal realism, I think that it's one, of course, what's interesting, right, is this sort of emergence of international law, right, as a field, as a domain, right, and which traditionally was about power and politics and diplomacy. And so to the extent that international law increasingly becomes a legal field, and increasingly then you see sort of the role of law and courts and judging and jurisprudence, then, and its implications in terms of social change, right? Its implications deep within Brazil in terms of how Brazilian elites view capital controls, or how they view money laundering, right? Or how they view, for instance, I find quite fascinating, both in China and Brazil, to the potential way to think about trade and environment is when the tires case, where, and I don't know the answer to this, you would know much better, but where Brazil now has to try to legitimate, maybe, and many people think in a sort of in a false, misleading way, so that it had these restrictions on the import of retreaded tires on environmental grounds. It actually had to justify that, right? But in justifying that, what's fascinating is it has all sorts of implications for environmental players, NGOs, and so forth that really want to develop environmental policy in Brazil. So it's not just a purely international matter, right? Where really the legal realist sort of law and society perspective would be, well, what sort of, in the mere process of having to justify having, quote, a comprehensive environmental program, right? How does that play out in terms of what Brazil actually does with respect to retreaded tires and the relative role of potentially a relatively weak environmental ministry vis-a-vis other ministries, right? And in the rare earths case in China, I'm quite fascinated, it'd be fascinating to see empirical work, is where China has to try to come up with an Article 20 environmental exception for this. It creates, China, you see, creating new green papers and citing new green papers on the environmental hazards of mining for these rare earth materials. But that there are groups within China and within the Communist Party that want to move towards greater environmental protection. And the mere fact that they're playing in both the international and the national field opens up the possibility for these interest groups to actually push for types of environmental regulation, which otherwise, it's at least an empirical question. And to me, that's the real fascinating area of international law, which are these transnational implications. And so I think in many areas, once one looks at international law, of course, part of it could be just simply studies of the international court, the WTO court as a domestic court, and of course it's not purely a court, so it's slightly different. And so but the empirical questions asked will be relatively similar, I think, or certainly be analogous. But once one starts to ask what are the consequences of international law or transnational law for society, which is really a law and society question, then you have to go within the nation state, right, to look at what are the implications for social behavior, for the way we conceptualize problems, the way we conceptualize what the right, good policy is, and so forth. And that's great. And then the third one, the floodgate and the SEALs case. I don't know I think it's fascinating. I raised it because I don't know the answer, and I think it's a fascinating one. And it's a real question that I would say then raises institutional issues, which is the institutionalist aspect of a new legal realism. So the question really becomes a comparative one of what all institutions are going to be imperfect, right? So permitting complete, a significant amount of autonomy, right, for the United States, Europe, and other jurisdictions, for example, to limit imports of developing countries on labor grounds, opens up potentially a huge huge hole. At the same time, there's imperfections where you have very limited international labor law and international labor institutions, and you have a very strong international trade regime, which would suddenly cut off completely, potentially in a very neoliberal way, any sort of attempts to try to address labor concerns. And so maybe that's a better alternative, but I think you need to compare the different alternatives. What's the relation? So what they did clearly in the trade regime was at least come up with some core labor standards, right? So that minimum wage may be completely inappropriate. Child labor even may be inappropriate, right? But so union organizing, other types may be something which would be more appropriate. But that then becomes an empirical question concerning what are the different institutional alternatives to address real social policy challenges, and what are the relative trade-offs of addressing those, looking at the consequences from two different perspectives. One would be a social welfare perspective in terms of labor, capital, and so forth. And the other would be who participates in these different institutional contexts. So clearly, the challenge in trade and labor or trade and union, if you show complete deference to unilateral action, foreigners are completely unrepresented in those processes. So how can you try to discipline those processes to try to make them more accountable and put significant constraints, but maybe not, maybe leave some openness for that?
Well, Cayado, and then Michael and Roberto. Is there any other mic around here?
Hi, Greg. Just a provocation that in a world of increasing importance of empirics and economics and behavior studies in legal research, what is actually the role left for the legal scholar? Do we still have a role to play there? Why don't we just hire a very good student from social science university and put him to measure costs and benefits and pass that along to the politicians, and they will make the decision?
Yeah.
I'll ask a question that goes along the same lines.
Okay.
I remember first, Greg, great tour de force of the history and contextualizing it. I think someone of your experience was probably one of the few people who can probably do that. So congratulations on that paper. I remember in 2007 at the American Society for International Law, a very senior lawyer, whose name I shan't mention, you all know him, stood up and addressed another very senior lawyer at that one who was commenting about the value of empirical research. And he said, "We are first-class lawyers, not third-rate social scientists."
Who said that again?
I shan't.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard that, but I heard that. So I heard that exact quote before, yeah.
So you know who it is? And
No, I don't remember, yeah.
It was a bit unfair because the person he was addressing actually has a PhD from Oxford in the social sciences. So it was very unfair in that way. But therein lies the question. I can think, for example, that Matsushita tells me that when they were deciding the alcohol case for Japan, they requested specifically for him to bring along soju as much as possible so they could sample it. And one could get a legal realism approach and say, that's why we don't understand the case. The same issue about after lunch. Have we controlled for other variables? Are we equipped to control for other variables? It could be, for example, that the reason why it was more sentencing after lunch was because the case was more complicated. And a more complicated case results potentially in a more serious and severe sentence. Correlation, as you said before, even in the scientific field of genetics, has been shown to be the main one that they're relying on rather than causation, because causation by nature is very difficult to prove. Mm-hmm. Some economists try to do it by regression analysis, but you need a large enough data set to do a regression analysis. And I think of, for example, even in the economic field, where Steve Levericks in the Freakonomics field has shown that sometimes it is the more complicated explanation that gives the answer rather than that. And even for himself, Steve Levericks, with some of he's been criticized and shown to be wrong on some of his issues as well. So the first question is, one, are we equipped to do this empirical research? Second, is the data we're working with, particularly data sets, which are very small, sufficient for us to really come to any conclusions about this? I think about the old research that we used to do on BITs and bilateral investment treaties to say BITs do not increase trade, they do not increase investments. But the new research and new data, which may be again wrong, suggests that it depends on the type of BITs you're looking at. The BITs which have national treatment clauses, which also have pre-establishment rights, do increase trade and investment. So I'm just a little bit struggling, and you know that I do this sort of research as well, and I struggle with these issues because the data sets are small, of how we can feel any confidence in our empirical approaches. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a little surprised with the comments I'm hearing about empirical research. I guess there is a fundamental misconception in some of the viewings here. It's the understanding that empirical studies, I'm not sure. There's this some misunderstanding that empirical studies can bring you the truth about anything. You know, in social science, we have solved this problem a long time ago. Every observation is an observation made from a point of observation. Yeah. So you can see part of something, but you can't see other things. So the major concern here, what are we doing with these empirical legal studies? We can't, can we be confident if we can't see everything? Of course we can. It's better to see something than seeing nothing. So this is the first comment. And the second one, it's, I don't see empirical legal studies as something who comes to replace a legal doctrine. Empirical studies are here to bring complexity to doctrine, to better inform, doctrine in a world that requires further observation of how things turn out to be. I think about family law. If we're going to decide anything about family, we need to see how new families, homosexual couples, children being raised by one parent, anyway, many new configurations that we need to be better informed to build a better family law. So we need empirical studies to understand how the world works and develops. But we have to know, to be sure, that any empirical study, not a single one, not a group of empirical studies, will bring the truth about any domain or field. So this is one point that I would like you to expand on. And the other one, it's, I'm very happy that you mentioned the risks of the empirical studies. And one risk you mentioned, it's this aura of science. We can make better informed doctrine, but we can't have this pretension that we can make the doctrine that is based on the truth. This is the aura of science. We are dealing not with physics or biology, but with social sciences. So any conclusion of social sciences is a conclusion based on this point of observation who can bring you a better informed position, but not the truth. But on the other hand, you have in the new legal realist movement, I guess, two main problems. One is this misconception sometimes permeates some of the studies, this understanding that we can explain something. And one of the things that calls my attention, some people who works with new legal realism, people from the American Bar Foundation, for instance, very smart and well-informed people, but they do multi-method research. And they have this understanding that with multi-methods, we can see everything. For me, it's a problem. It's an epistemological difficulty. I work with Luhmann and systems theory. You just see from this point of observation. But there is, so for me, there is the problem with the new legal realism. Besides this pretension to say the truth about anything, this lack of theory sometimes is the problem that the new legal realism movement brings with it. I don't know how you see it. It's a big comment. I'd like you to expand on that.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you said, basically. I mean, multi-methods, of course. I mean, I don't know if the people at the Bar Foundation, to who you're referring to, would make the claim that multi-method somehow gives it the aura of science, where a single method doesn't. It's just they would say, but we actually, in a new paper with Victoria Norse and me, we make the same comment about multi-methods, right? And so the main argument we make is that the old legal realists were viewed as skeptics of the value of law, whereas what we call for the new legal realists, which is to be not skeptics but fallibilists, and the fallibilists not only with respect to their own methods, right? And so that it comes out of what's known as a pragmatist tradition of John Dewey and others in the United States, which is that all methods are providing us with new information in order to try to address social policy concerns, because we have no other choice. We should try to address them with information as opposed to no information, right? But I agree. Let me just say a couple of things about the role for legal scholars. There's going to be a special issue in the Leiden Journal of International Law that I've organized on a new legal realism. And there, I start off by saying, within jurisprudence, traditionally, there were 3 traditions in jurisprudence, but jurisprudence has eliminated one of them, which is the empirical social law and society tradition of jurisprudence. So one tradition of jurisprudence is legal positivism, which would be looking at formal law and doctrinal law and creating a science of law and so forth. A second would be natural law theory and the morality of law and thinking purely of normative concerns in terms of law. And most of jurisprudence today, at least in the United States, analytic jurisprudence either asks these questions: what's the separation between law and morals on the one hand, and what are the sources of law, the pedigree theories of that law, comes from a certain pedigree from H.L.A. Hart or a Grun norm from Kelsen and so forth. So that's sort of become the dominant. And what we're arguing is not that new legal realism is opposed to these. It's just simply asking different questions, and they're important questions. They're not the only questions. So that if you're making an argument before a lawyer, you're going to be a good lawyer, as you said. There's a role for good lawyers to make good arguments before judges. And I give an example in this paper of this debate between Joel Trachtman and Joost Pauwelen, sort of 2 WTO legal scholars, on a very famous debate as to what's the role of other international law in interpreting WTO agreements. And Professor Pauwelen says that other international law, such as human rights law, labor law, environmental law, applies. And Professor Trachtman says, no, you only apply the covered agreements to WTO agreements. And I say, well, that's very important depending on who's right in terms of the legal arguments you make before the appellate body, right? And that anybody would make one of those 2 legal arguments depending on which side they're representing as a good lawyer, right? And as a good judge, they'll make a decision based on the Vienna Convention law treaties one way or the other. But I say that in terms of if you're actually working for a government, what you're interested in, for instance, is defending the precautionary principle with respect to genetically modified foods, or a cultural exception with respect to films, right? You will promote a new biosafety protocol in the Convention on Biodiversity. You will promote a new UNESCO Convention on Cultural Heritage, right? And you do that and you will raise those agreements in a WTO case. And the key issue will be to make the WTO decision maker aware that they need to take into account of these decisions, whether or not they do so in some sort of soft way, whether or not they do so in some sort of formalist way. As a lawyer representing a client, ultimately that doesn't matter. What matters is that they take them into account, right? And so you're going to come up with different formal legal theories, and those are important, right? But a legal realist is actually concerned in how decision-making is shaped through soft law, hard law, interpretive methods, and so forth. Because for a legal realist, law has a penumbra which involves relatively open-ended provisions that are going to be interpreted in particular factual contexts. And those factual contexts will matter, such as whether or not it involves labor regulation or SEALs, right? And so legal realists go back and they'll say that what really matters are not just formal law and the scientific study of formal law, but formal law can be interpreted in different ways, and facts and factual contexts are central. So to go back to the old legal realists, what they're critiquing is that there was one form of freedom of contract. And they said, well, no, contract law between multilateral between big corporations, that's one type of contract. But contract law between a corporation and a consumer is another contract. And contracts between a worker and a corporation is another type of contract. And you need to look at the factual context in order to try to develop legal doctrine and interpretation. And so there's a role for legal scholars. In terms of, should we be third-rate scholars, I think that that's just a false dichotomy. It's a dichotomy. It's an either-or, right? I think any legal scholar, besides when they're not simply playing the role, even if they're playing the role of an advocate before a judge, they're not only arguing legal doctrine, they're arguing facts. And once you start to argue facts in the context of legal doctrine, you're in the world of empirics. And you just can't say the idea of formal law is it's something that hovers above the messy world of facts, right? But we all know that legal doctrine is something that needs to be interpreted in a world of facts and in a world of uncertainty with respect to what the facts are. And so there's a role for empirics, whether or not the lawyer does it, whether or not they work with a social scientist, whether or not they do some of it on their own, in order to, because lawyers have a certain understanding of law that someone trained purely in the social sciences don't have. And they can subsume, as I said, the real risks of the other social sciences, and only looking to them in terms of what they can teach us in terms of law is that they're going to bring their disciplinary blinders in terms of what are the variables that matter for their discipline, such as power and international relations. And law can be elided, right? And law can be missed. So there's a real role for, and also lawyers play huge positions, right, in decision making. Not only, Cass Sunstein, who calls himself a new legal realist, became head of OIRA within the Office for Regulatory Affairs, which has to review every regulation that goes through government, and everyone has to be subject to a cost-benefit analysis. So to have somebody who's a lawyer with no sense of empirics, right, would be very problematic. And so lawyers have to have these tools in the world of decision-making and problem-solving today.
Well, it's time to close.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Greg. I think that just one data for you. I'm looking for how much empirical research have been part of the SIEL works. And then what I found for you that are postgraduate in junior faculty, I would say that I just found 13 papers at the SIEL conferences No, at the global SIEL conference.
Yeah.
But that means only that those were papers where people were expressly mentioning that they were applying empirical method.
Yeah.
So there are others that are doing that, but not maybe consciously. And there is a lot of work done in our field to do this. And this is, I think that you gave a lot for us to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.